Hey everybody, welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm Diana Gasparoni and I'm the founder of BeWELL Psychotherapy, and I'm super excited because Gillian here is here tonight to take you through our second in a series of Wellness Matters talks, and she's going to talk to you about identity. So Gillian, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be doing this. Thank you to everybody who has taken some time out of their evening to join me for this webinar. I have decided to put together a presentation on identity. I think it's something that has been very prevalent over the past 8 months or so, but also something that is prevalent throughout our lives, sort of throughout the whole process. So not just who we are in the present moment, but who we have been and who we would like to be or find ourselves becoming. So I will get started. So this is a little bit about me. I typically, well, I'm a licensed mental health counselor. And I have been in practice for approximately 8 years. And I got my start working, interning, and then working at an LGBTQ focused therapy center in Manhattan, and have since branched out into private practice. And so a lot of the work that I did while I was there focused a lot on identity development. And so not just in terms of sexual orientation identity or gender identity, but expanded into identity, as it relates to other parts of our lives, and how they all intersect and interconnect, and how we're all affected by that. So when we think about identity, I think a good place to start is for the people who've joined us to think about, when you hear the word identity, what are like the top 2 or 3 things that come up for you? How do you identify? How do you navigate the world? Which identities are most prominent at any given time? And how does your life look based on how you identify? And in terms of how identity is defined from like a psychological perspective, it's how we understand and define ourselves in the context of the world, how we relate to others, and how others relate to us, and also our sense of self. And so some of the things that I have listed here are, I think, more of the major things that we think about in terms of identity, but there are, it doesn't stop there. It kind of keeps going, and we can identify in any way that we feel is appropriate to who we are. So, crisis of identity. For the sake of our time this evening, I have selected to focus on career. It's something that I've dealt with this year with all of the changes during the pandemic. And I think it's something that, it's something that's come up for a lot of my clients during this time, either due to a shift to working from home, a loss of employment. And these things can cause us to think about ourselves in different ways and think about how we interact differently with ourselves as a result of that. Who am I essentially if I'm not, who I know myself to be in the context of a work environment? Or if my professional identity is not what it used to be, what does that mean for other parts of my life? And what does it mean for other identities that exist in my life? And so moving from that, how do these thoughts and feelings affect us? What are they, and how do they show up in our lives? And so something that has been really noticeable in the work with my clients is that, we're doing multiple things at once. We're parents, we're partners, we're teachers, we're students, and sometimes all of those things coexist. And that can, in terms of role confusion, it's like, okay, well, who am I at any given point, especially when the space in which all of those parts of ourselves exist is happening in the same space. And so in terms of things like acting out and frustration, I think those are some of the more common things that have come up over the past few months. Sort of frustration about how to move forward, and how does a shift in how I think of myself affect what decisions I want to make down the line. And given the current circumstances, I think it can be really difficult to know what a right decision looks like, or what a safe decision looks like. And there are more factors and generally more uncertainty about knowing what the future holds and how to make decisions based on that. And then something else that I think is really important and doesn't really get talked about enough is grief. So as we move from one part of our life to another, or shift from one identity to another, there's often grief that comes up. And a lot of times it's not necessarily identified as grief. Sometimes it can show up looking more like depression. And in terms of how we look at that in relation to identity, I think it's important to know that sometimes we're not who we used to be, and we can miss that part of ourselves. We can wish that we were in another part of our life. I'm in terms of my own experience with it, there were things that I was hoping to do this year and people I was hoping to see this year, and that didn't obviously come to fruition. And so there is sort of a definitely a missing of that part of my life, but also a part of myself, who I am in those other environments. And also just looking at this in terms of anger, I think that this is particularly relevant for people who live with other people, whether it's a spouse or a roommate, and it's also tied into grief. I think that those definitely coexist, and I think that the way in which we express how we feel about our identity, even if it's not something that is totally present in our minds, I think is really important and can affect how we go through life on like a more day-to-day basis. Also, if anybody has any questions, I think it would be, instead of waiting towards the end, you're more than welcome to type them in and ask away. So something that, I think there are a lot of ways that we can sort of deal with a crisis of identity or a shifting of identity. In terms of community, I think it's really important to know who your people are and know what your support system looks like. And obviously that's going to be different for everybody. For some people, it's going to be friends. For others, it's going to be family. Who are the people that support you, and who are the people who support your different identities and are there for you in a way that validates who you are, regardless of where you are in your process.
Gillian, can we talk a little bit about what it's like when we're talking about our people and who to go to? Because we show up for our people we may show up with a different part of ourselves, and how to bring our whole self. Allow the grieving part, like maybe it's the career loss, how we bring that to the conversation if like your friend is thriving at work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that we might be less likely to open ourselves up to people who are maybe in a different position than we are in. I think it's harder to be vulnerable if other people in your life are not going through a similar thing, either logistically or emotionally. And I think in terms of knowing who your people are, and showing up for other people, not necessarily in the way that you show up for yourself, is really important. I think we are oftentimes a lot more patient with other people. We are often, we speak differently to ourselves than we speak to other people. Oftentimes we are much harder on ourselves and think that we need to have everything figured out and we need to know what we're doing all the time. And at the end of the day, like, that's not always realistic, and nobody has it all figured out all the time. And so to have patience with yourself and trust your own process, I think is really important in terms of validating who you are.
I'm jumping in again.
Yeah,
I wanted also to look at a little bit too about, I mean, obviously while you're talking, I'm thinking about my own many time identity crises that have happened over my lifetime. But there is that, in that grief bit, and in the becoming, I mean, I like to think about it as like the caterpillar who's becoming the butterfly. So like, but there's so much,
it's hard to see through the cocoon sometimes.
Right. There is that cracking open part that can be painful. And how do we put words to that, I think, is really important, is something that you can speak to. Like, where do we get the language for that?
Right. Well, and that's where I think therapy is incredibly useful. Sometimes we don't have the language for how we're feeling or even how we're identifying. And oftentimes during transition periods, the feeling of, being overwhelmed or being scared can totally take over. And it's easy to miss the other experiences. It's easier to not see the growth that is also happening in that transition. And so therapy is a really wonderful way to, at your own pace, to learn more about yourself and to trust yourself and to trust the process that you're going through.
Yeah, and I want to give a funny anecdote. I remember prior to being a therapist, I was a yoga teacher. And one of the things that was really hard for me is what do therapists wear to work? Which sounded so small, but I surveyed every single one of my friends to find out what their therapist wore to work. Like I was like, well, what do you do? Like, and it was like really like in that shift, like my questions were when I look back on them now, they were so funny. I was like, do I have to cut my hair? Like, do I have to cut my hair? I can't wear yoga pants to work. Like, it can get very confusing. I think that's the other part of an identity crisis is like, or an identity shift or transition is like, you get confused and you have to, in the confusion, there's so much, I know I'm making like meatballs with my hands here, but there's so much grist for the mill, right? Like how do you want to show up in that other identity, in that place when you haven't actually ever experienced it? Like you don't know.
Right. And I think the best thing to do is just to show up. And I think sometimes with therapy, a lot of the work isn't always, at least not immediately, about what's going on in the room as it's happening. But I think a lot of times just showing up to therapy is sometimes the most important thing that you can do for yourself. And it sort of teaches you over time that as you show up for yourself, one, you learn about who you are and like what you want or what you don't want. And we learn about ourselves through that process. But also I think it takes away some of the fear that can come along with change and with growth and with identity shifts, because you're showing up and you're doing it. And eventually the thing that used to scare you can become second nature in a way. It becomes routine. It becomes familiar.
Yeah. Oh, I shut off my camera. It does. It's so, when you look back on it over the lifetime, I think that one of the things that we see as clinicians and also within ourselves is that, like, when people come and sit with us through, and we've chosen career as a topic to just like make it tangible for today, but like if you're having a baby, or if you're getting married, or if you're moving, like there's so like, or somebody dies, or
Yeah.
somebody leaves you, like, or there's a breakup, like there's so many different shifts in your life that in the transition, I know we said it in the podcast, but I think it's like in, what did I say? It's in the
Oh, I thought what you said
transition.
was beautiful. It was the information is in the transition.
Yeah, it is
And
all.
that's where we learn the most about ourselves, and learn what we can tolerate, and learn what, maybe still needs some work. And through that, especially I think through loss and change through loss, uh, learning about who we are as individuals, as well as who we are in the context of other relationships in our life, and where maybe other people were showing up for us when it would be more helpful in some capacity for us to show up for ourselves and take care of ourselves in a different way.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking, I wanted to go back just quickly now that I'm up here with you chit chatting, and talk about, because I see Molly jumped in. It is how that we acknowledge and leave enough room for the grief, and I think we don't, as a culture, we don't celebrate the transitions as, because they're painful and in the grief, we're not necessarily celebrating the actual work and the transition. And I think we're not looking at, as we mourn, what we're going through. And I'm thinking of it as I'm talking to you, as like,
Mm-hmm.
when parents start, when their kids become teenagers, like there is this mourning period that doesn't get put into words, because they are becoming different parents, and the teenager themselves is also mourning as they're leaving the parent in a different
Mm-hmm.
way. And so that is sort of where our first identity obviously is our identity is developed in like the first 7 years, according to Erickson. But we keep going over and over again. We shift and change so many times. But that one we have actual language for, because we see it, and we, as teens, we're like really pushing away. We're like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be an adult, and
And we have no idea. And I think that's such a great example, because when we are teenagers, we're so hell bent on like becoming who we think we're going to be, and then we get there, and then we're like, I have no idea, surprise. And then it never it never, in some ways, it never really gets solidified. It's kind of like life; it's always growing and changing, and so are we. And like, I think the conversation culturally around identity could benefit from a little bit of change, in terms of how we think we're supposed to be, and what influences that, and are we making those decisions based on what we think we should be doing, as opposed to what we want to do and what feels right for us.
Can you speak a little bit about why? I mean, I know we're talking about like things like losing a job, or a a kid becoming a teenager, which I think parents should just get handbooks on that, which
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's going to ask me
Wait,
for.
you mean kids don't come with handbooks
Yeah,
when
exactly.
they're born?
But I'm thinking, like, what are some of the individual reasons that they actually become quote unquote crises, and we don't just like move through them?
I think if we find ourselves struggling to sort of get through the day, if we find thoughts spiraling, and anxiety becoming overwhelming, or depression really setting in a way that causes us to not operate in the way that we know ourselves to operate, I think that's kind of when the little red lights start spinning, and it might be an indication that there is something that could be worked through. And it's hard to identify what the source of that is. I don't think it's always obvious that there is a shift in identity happening. And so it can take shape in a way that doesn't seem obvious. So something like, moving apartments, or, something not necessarily as obvious as we might expect it to be.
I know I'm sharing a lot of all of my identity crises, but I moved out of New York City and I'm devastated.
Yeah, well, there's a real identity in being a New Yorker, regardless of where you're from.
I am a New Yorker, and it doesn't make any sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
So we only have a few people hanging out with us. So I want to know, Molly, I see you. Do you have any questions for us?
Well, I'm also curious to know what, when you think about identity, and I know that this wasn't necessarily intended to be interactive, so there's no pressure to participate. But I'm curious to know what identities have been most prevalent for you, really since the pandemic, and if there's anything that you've noticed a real shift in.
I mean, I can answer that.
Yeah, I know. Me too.
It's a tough one. I think one of the things that we've also talked about is that just as a profession, I know that I've said it in a few blogs or social media posts or on IGTV or something, is that there is we're all going through it conversation, everybody's going through it, but everybody is we're not all in the same boat.
Right.
We're definitely on the same ocean, but we are not all in the same boat. And I think that in my own personal experience of being an extrovert, I'm out all the time, and I'm oh God, no, I'm not out all the time anymore. And what that feels like has also been, and not living in New York, has also been two of the biggest things for me. And I know when I have when I've talked about it with my analysts, it's just been wow. I mean, the sadness of not seeing people and having those kind of things, and those are real. But I think who I am as a person and the things that really defined who I thought I was and what I know I can live without now. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and I found myself mourning the part of me that was 24 years old that would stay out until 4 in the morning.
Yep.
Right? And yes, it's very tough not seeing people, even when yes, I see you, Molly, when you are an introvert, because you could, and introverts too, because you grab energy just quietly being around people. And it was a patient I was talking to today about but you're in that, you have people around you all the time,
mm-hmm.
and those things aren't happening. So that part, and then really being in your own mind a lot.
Yeah, and that's something that has definitely come up for people who live on their own. So there's the element of what is it like to live with other people and always be surrounded by other people and not have that time and space for yourself. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are very much in their thoughts and very much in their anxiety. And that's coming up for people I'm noticing who maybe had some anxiety in their past, but it wasn't something that was quite as predominant as it is now.
Mm-hmm. And I know you have another slide. I keep jumping in.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to let you go. I think we talked about it.
So yes, we did talk a little bit about this. Sorry?
No, I like this slide because I like her hair. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I thought the same thing when I saw it.
Yeah, it's that redhead bonding. Go ahead.
Yeah. We got to stick together, even if she's just in a photo. So I think therapy is, again, I'm biased as someone who is a therapist, but also as someone who is in therapy. I can speak from the other side of the couch, where it sort of opens our eyes to things about ourselves that we didn't necessarily know existed. And I think therapy can be very illuminating in that regard. And it's a great place really to learn how to fail as humans, I think. And I know that doesn't sound good, but I'll explain it. How can failing be good? Well, it teaches us who we are and what we're made of, and what our capacity is for different experiences, different kinds of people, and helps us figure out and identify who we are. And it's sort of a general statement, but if we're talking in terms of stick to the theme in terms of career, I wasn't sure how I was going to handle my transition into the BeWELL work environment. I've been fortunate to be here for, I guess about 8 months. I started at BeWELL a week into the pandemic. I've never had the opportunity to work from the office. And so, there were definitely thoughts of like, okay, well, how does this affect my identity as a therapist, as someone who's now working from, a remote situation, when all I knew and was familiar with was being able to be in the room with people and knowing how therapy looks from that perspective and that experience. And also as a client, not going to my therapist's office and having space that is dedicated to sort of introspection and self-discovery, and now like to find ways to do that differently. And it's definitely been an adjustment, but it's also taught me a lot about myself. And I think that even with some of my own clients, like that shift is also happening, and there are bigger discussions around who we are in that environment, and really identifying like how strong we can be even when we don't think that we can handle certain things. And then what else do we have? Oh, there we go. What we will do together. So in terms of how I work, I definitely like to have therapy be more conversational and more engaging. I think especially in current times, I don't think it's always helpful to be like the cliche silent therapist type. I think there's a time and a place for it. And I think in terms of being able to interact with people in different ways and be more flexible and obviously still being professional and ethical, but being, I think, more relaxed in how we approach other people and more human about the process, I think is really important. And I like therapy to be a place where, yes, it's good to have, short-term and long-term goals, but it's also a place where there can be a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty, and to learn how to live in the gray area, because at the end of the day, nothing is really black and white. It's a whole lot of gray area. And as uncomfortable as that can be, there's also something very rewarding in being able to learn to live in that space. And sorry?
I was just going to say, where can we find you?
You can find me not at the BeWELL office, but you are more than welcome to connect with me through our different ways of getting in touch with our wonderful BeWELL staff via email, phone, and text. And we are also on social media, sort of expanding into this new world of the internet and communicating and engaging in a different way.
Well, I'll come back, race back, hold on. Thank you so much, Gillian. This was fun. And I've learned a lot. I think it's great. I think identity is it's such a broad topic, but it's something that we really, as clinicians, obviously, but as people, allowing ourselves to really sit in the muck of it, and like allows us so much room for so much more growth and expansion. And I hear that in everything that we just talked about. So thank you for representing BeWELL today, and
Thank you for having me.
we will see you guys next month. Okay, thanks so much. If you have any questions, just please feel free to reach out, and someone will get back to you ASAP. Okay, bye now.